horde's army approached 500,000 strong. His own army numbered fewer than 30,000, including the apprentices. None of this was lost on the enemy, and yet they'd sent only this small band of hooded warriors up the gap to their deaths. Why? They rode without a word. Hoofs thundered like war drums, an oddly comforting sound. Their horses were all stallions. Each fighter was dressed in the same hardened leather breastplate with forearm and thigh guards. These left their joints free for the movement required in hand-to-hand combat. They strapped their knives to calves and whips to hips, and carried their swords on their horses. These three weapons, a good horse and a leather bottle full of water, were all any of the forest guard required to survive a week and to kill 100, and the regular fighting force wasn't far behind. Thomas flew over the hill's crest, leaned back, and pulled the stallion to a stamping halt. The others fell in along the ridge. Still, not a word. What they saw could not easily be put into words. The sky was turning red, blood red, as it always did over the desert in the afternoons. To their right stretched the canyon lands, 10 square miles of cliffs and boulders that acted as a natural barrier between the red deserts and the first of 7 forests, Thomas's forest. Beyond the canyon's cliffs, red-tinged sand flowed into an endless sea of desert. This landscape was as familiar to Thomas as his own forest. What he saw now was not. At first glance, even to a trained eye, the subtle movement on the desert floor might have been mistaken for shimmering heat waves. It was hardly more than a beige discoloration rippling across the vast section of flat sand that fed into the canyons. But this was nothing so innocuous as desert heat. This was the Horde army. They wore beige hooded tunics to cover their gray scabbed flesh, and rode light tan horses bred to disappear against the sand. Thomas had once ridden past 50 without distinguishing them from the sandstone. "How many, Nikhil?" His second-in-command searched the horizon to the south. He followed her eyes. A dozen smaller contingents were heading up the gap, armies of a few hundred each, not so much larger than the one they'd torn apart 30 minutes ago. 100,000, she said. A strip of leather held her dark hair back from a tanned forehead. A small white scar on her right cheek marred an otherwise smooth, milky complexion. The cut had been inflicted not by the Horde, but by her own brother, who'd fought to assert his strength just a year ago. She'd left him unscathed, underfoot, soundly defeated. He'd died in a skirmish 6 months after. Nikhil's green eyes skirted the desert. "This will be a challenge." Thomas grunted at the understatement. They'd all been hardened by dozens of battles, but never had they faced an army so large. "The main body is moving south along the southern cliffs." She was right. This was a new tactic for the Horde. "They're trying to engage us in the Natalga Gap while the main force flanks us," Thomas said. "And they look to succeed," his Lieutenant William said. No one disagreed. No one spoke. No one moved. Thomas scanned the horizon again and reviewed their bearings. To the west, the desert ended in the same forested valley he'd protected from the Horde threat for the past 15 years, ever since the boy had led them to the small paradise in the middle of the desert. To the north and the south lay 6 other similar forests, inhabited by roughly 100,000 forest people. Thomas and Rochelle had not met their first forest dweller until nearly a full year after finding the lake. His name was Siphus of Southern, for he came from the great southern forest. That was the year they gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Marie, Marie of Thomas. Those who'd originally come from the colored forest took designation according to which forests they lived in, thus Siphus of Southern. The children who were born after the Great Deception took the names of their fathers, Marie of Thomas. 3 years later, Rochelle and Thomas had a son, Samuel, a strong lad, nearly 12 now. He was wielding a sword already, and Thomas had to speak loudly to keep him from joining the battles. Each forest had its own lake, and Elion's faithful bathed each day to keep the painful skin disease from overtaking their bodies. This ritual cleansing was what separated them from the scabs. Each night, after bathing, the forest people danced and sang in celebration of the great romance, as they called it, and each year the people of all 7 forests, roughly 100,000 now, made the pilgrimage to the largest forest, called the Middle Forest, Thomas's Forest. The annual gathering was to be held 7 days from today. How many forest people were now making the exposed trek across the desert, Thomas hated to imagine. Scabs could become forest people, of course. A simple bathing in the lake would cleanse their skin and wash away their disgusting stench. A small number of scabs had become forest people over the years, but it was the unspoken practice of the forest guard to discourage horde defections. There simply weren't enough lakes to accommodate all of them. In fact, Siphus of Southern, the council elder, had calculated that the lakes could function adequately for only 300,000. There simply wasn't enough water for the horde, who already numbered well over 1 million. The lakes were clearly a gift from Elyon to the forest people alone. Discouraging the horde from bathing was not difficult. The intense pain of moisture on their diseased flesh was enough to fill the scabs with a deep revulsion for the lakes, and Korong, their leader, had sworn to destroy the waters when he conquered the much-coveted resources of the forest lands. The desert dwellers had first attacked 13 years ago, descending on a small forest 200 miles to the southwest. Although the clumsy attackers had been beaten back with rocks and clubs, over 100 of Elyon's followers, mostly women and children, had been slaughtered. Despite his preference for peace, Thomas had determined then that the only way to secure peace for the forest people was to establish an army. With the help of Johann, Rochelle's brother, Thomas went in hunt of metal, drawing upon his recollection of the histories. He needed copper and tin, which when mixed would form bronze, a metal strong enough for swords. They'd built a furnace and then heated rocks of all varieties until they found the kind that leaked the telltale ore. As it turned out, the canyon lands were full of ore. He still wasn't sure if the material from which he'd fashioned the first sword was actually bronze, but it was soft enough to sharpen and hard enough to cut off a man's head with a single blow. The horde came again, this time with a larger force. Armed with swords and knives, Thomas and 100 fighters, his first forest guard, cut the attacking desert dwellers to shreds. Word of a mighty warrior named Thomas of Hunter spread throughout the desert and forests alike. For 3 years after, the horde braved only the occasional skirmish, always to their own terrible demise. But the need to conquer the fertile forest land proved too strong for the swelling horde. They brought their first major campaign up the Natalga Gap armed with new weapons, bronze weapons, long swords and sharp sickles and large balls swinging from chains. Though defeated then, their strength had continued to grow since. It was during the winter campaign 3 years ago that Johann went missing. The forest people had mourned his loss at the gathering that year. Some had begged Elyon to remember his promise to deliver them from the heart of evil, from the horde's curse, in one stunning blow. That day would surely come, Thomas believed, because the boy had spoken it before disappearing into the lake. It would be best for Thomas and his guard if today was that day. "They'll be at our catapults along the southern cliffs in 3 marks on the dial," McKill said, referring to the sundials Thomas had introduced to keep time. Then she added, 3 hours. Thomas faced the desert. The diseased horde army was pouring into the canyons like whipped honey. By nightfall the sands would be black with blood, and this time it would be as much their blood as the horde's. An image of Rochelle and young Marie and his son Samuel filled his mind. A knot swelled in his throat. The rest had children too, many children, in part to even odds with the horde. How many children in the forests now? Nearly half the population, 50,000. They had to find a way to beat back this army, if only for the children. Thomas glanced down the line at his lieutenants, masters in combat each one. He secretly believed any of them could capably lead this war, but he never doubted their loyalty to him, the guard, and the forests. Even William, who was more than willing to point out Thomas's faults and challenge his judgment, would give his life. In matters of ultimate loyalty, Thomas had set the standard. He would rather lose a leg than a single one of them, and they all knew it. They also knew that, of them all, Thomas was the least likely to lose a leg or any other body part in any fight. This even though he was 40, and many of them in their 20s.